get us started?
Sure. Father, again, we're so blessed to have a fellowship that Jesus has drawn us together in. We thank you for our friends that have been taught by Jesus, and we just pray that Jesus will be here in our midst. We are thinking about Tom Torrance, and we're just glad that Kurt is here with us. And, you know, apprehending the knowledge of who you are as our God and our Savior is a difficult thing for us, but yet by the power of your Spirit, you're able to do all things. So, Father, we pray your Spirit will be here to bless us and allow us to enjoy this fellowship, and that even though there's only a few number here, that many will hear the recording. And we thank you for the blessing of us being able to use this technology and share your word and talk about who you are as our God and our Savior. Thank you, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Dwayne.
Amen.
So Kurt, not everybody knows you here. So I just want you to start and tell us a little bit of your story, how you got involved in theology, and specifically how you came across T.F. Torrance. And you can talk about your dissertation there, and then a little bit about your teaching career and what you're doing now.
Okay.
How's that for an outline?
So that we don't take too much time, because I love teaching. And if you love it that much, you can go on and on. Anyway, and even though I only care about juicy, good stuff, there's still a lot of good stuff to talk about. So I grew up as the oldest of three sons on the south coast of California. Instead of going to Princeton, I went to Palos Verdes High School, which was kind of hoity-toity. I was a part of the Southern California awakenings of the early 70s, you know, Calvary Chapel and all of that. And had also Pentecostal friends, was very affected by it, but didn't become Pentecostal. I was Baptist. And went to, instead of going to Princeton, where I could have gone, I was following the calling of God on my life after 16 years of age. So I went to Los Angeles Baptist College, which would eventually become the Master's College, where John MacArthur is, who is his own kind of Dallas 4-point Calvinist, which is worth always keeping in mind, by the way, since Tom had some of that that French Calvinist in him. The Scots have it, except for the very, the ones that stay away from the Dutch tradition, or at least that part of the Dortian tradition. Remember, that's only half of the Dutch tradition. And there are important Bardians and Torrancians in Holland. Anyway, after that, I went to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, studied with, was a protege of Harold Brown, the Reformed theologian there, and was a guest student at University of Basel when he was on a sabbatical in 81, 82, and 83. They invited me. The faculty said, please come back when you're done. And my new bride and I went to Basel, Switzerland, took up residence. We became very close friends of a number of the faculty members as well. Jan Lokman and Heinrich Ott were my professors. Jan Lokman, the Czech theologian who fled Prague Spring and became a professor in Basel in '68. And very important kind of counterpart with Moltmann and theology of liberation. But of course, close to a contemporary was Tom Torrance. And it was very, very rich to live for 4 years. We had 2 kids there in Basel, very rich. We still have very, very close friends. And both Swiss and non-Swiss on the faculty. It was a very beautiful time to be studying at Basel. So I got, we were going to do a dissertation on both Thomas Torrance and Eberhard Jungel. And there's a very big part of the dissertation on Jungel, but that's just too much. So I focused on Torrance as the greatest English language student and interpreter of Barth, and translator, obviously. And so I wrote on the Trinitarian creation, the uncreated and created interrelation, Trinitarian relation in Thomas Torrance. So I'm looking at my diploma across the room. Anyway, at that time, I met a leading Baptist historian, Timothy George, and through his connections and my Baptist background, I went to Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary as an assistant professor of theology and history of theology. So for quite a number of years, I did two disciplines, which was really good for me. I also did a lot of pastoring because we were getting more and more children, and my spouse, who's a biologist, was good enough to become the chairman of our home culture. And so I worked two jobs. So I did a lot of preaching as well. And that was good for me since I love analytic, to be grounded in the congregation, to be ordained, and to know that part of theology too. It's important as I've gone through the years. Early on, though, I had been groomed by my dad, which I frustrated him by not going into his international consulting business, but I had been able to do a lot of travel. And a lot of travel has been very important for me, building bridges and getting to know especially the theologians of the world's great religions, and especially, above all, Judaism and Islam, which is an important part of what I do now in representing Reformed theology to those worlds. In any case, the Southern Baptists were going through a lot of turmoil. It was, I was just sort of caught in the middle. As one friend of mine said, I'm deeply in the middle, which is kind of interesting too. I love that phrase. I was invited then to go to Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, which was a very, very important move to be in a non-denominational evangelical, very, very conservative seminary, sort of proudly more conservative than Fuller, and also fraught, not as fraught as Westminster, but fraught. And I certainly saw that and experienced it, and that conflict mode that certain evangelicals hunger for, the history of separatism in America is very destructive. You heard me sort of hit on it a little bit regarding, you heard me take a slight little slant at the Dutch. Well, the Dutch have had a history. They certainly brought quite a bit of separatism as they came and reproduced their communities here in North America. Of course, the Lutherans did too. And because I think American theology, American Protestant theology, and therefore all the theologies in America are profoundly shaped by the fundamentalist modernist controversy, and then the split, and then the continuing splits as almost an ecclesiological practice among the evangelicals until there was nothing, until they had their independence, and then they go parachurch, and then they just simply do fragmented theology many times until they get repoliticized, not having learned a thing from Prohibition and the Scopes trial. So we've been through a monkey trial in the last some years, and we're still very much in that trial to figure out how to put Christ first in everything, to put the church first in everything, but also to be responsible citizens. And we're in travail right now because the religious nationalism has overtaken just the fundamental thinking of so many people in the pew, if they're still in the pew, or they've been harmed by it. In any case, in 2001, I was called to McMaster Divinity College, which is was a mainstream Baptist university, McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, which is part of the big hub that is Toronto. This was a very good period for me. And I'll wrap this up pretty quick. From 1995, because of my international interest, and therefore whatever theology is happening in responsible ways around the world, whether China or the Middle East, Israel in particular, and then other Muslim countries. I was a co-founder and then leader in the American Academy of Religion in scriptural reasoning. That then, when I got to Boston, I became close friends and associates with Frank Clooney, the comparative theologian, Jesuit, who was at Boston College at the time, and then also Kimberly Patton at Harvard Divinity School. And they have been close companions and colleagues in projects in the second stage, which was comparative theology, which I co-founded and led for 5 years, and now doing Abrahamic theology or Abrahamic studies. But in the Evangelical Theological Society, I started with Stanley Grenz, a group called New Projects in Systematic Theology. Lots of things happened with that group, and it morphed. I still co-lead it with a former student of mine who is the senior professor of theology at Southeastern Seminary, actually, Ken Keithley. And in the fall, I'd like to invite anybody who's interested to at least come to the Thursday before the AAR, which is the last day of the ETS conference that'll be at Denver this year, because we will have a special invited panel dealing with Bruce McCormick's New Christology, which is massively important and represents something I'd like to think that T.F. Torrance would appreciate very, very much. Anyway, so that's ETS. After 13 years in Canada and developing a close relationship with Hartman Institute, which is sort of the divinity school of Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and then eventually with conversation partners in the Shia world in Iran. And for the last 14 years, I've done quite a bit of work with Muslim Shia theologians in Iran, mostly sharing the gospel and trying to understand where they're coming from. There's a lot of very interesting developments in Christian studies of the Quran, not the Islamic tradition, just the Quran. Very sola scriptura and what they call sola Qurana, and the companionship of the three scriptures Abrahamically. There's too much to go into because we want to talk about Torrance. Anyway, I had kept up a relationship with Torrance. I'd met him and spent time with him in Edinburgh during the dissertation time. I'd had him come to give a special lecture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, which he's kind enough to mention in the book edited by Elmer Collier, which has, I think, my most important interaction with Torrance's work in a way after the dissertation anyway. And that's why I recommend, which was dealing with key portions of the collected book of essays later published called Divine Meaning.
Right.
So we can move into that. Because of my work across the Abrahamic theological traditions, I was invited by Wycliffe Bible translators to a graduate school down here in Texas in 2015 and tried to help them get an Abrahamic studies group going. My work was getting bigger than they knew how to deal with. There's just tons of controversy about any dealings with the Muslims at all. And Judaism, Jewish theology helps us a lot, but the politics of religion is now more acute than ever.
Yes.
No one could really recognize it if you knew what even the conservative liberal divide was 30 years ago. You would not that these people would not recognize it anymore, and many of us don't want to really deal with it. I'm not an alarmist, but I know religious nationalism when I see it. Anyway, because also in working with Torrance, it was very important how he approached Europe, how he approached issues of Judaism. One of my closest colleagues and friends is David Novak, who can be called the Barthian Jewish theologian.
Huh. And
he has published 2 books on his reading of Barth, his deep appreciation of Barth. And we know how when Torrance wrote an essay on Barth, it was a hagiography for sure. He couldn't help it. Whatever degree of joy that Barth talked about, the fröhliche Wissenschaft, Torrance certainly had it. Many people talked about almost the childlike faith of Torrance. Definitely, we're not talking childish, but we're talking about delighting in the Lord. Yep. And the mysticism that I refer to in my chapter in my close reading of what Torrance wrote in a couple of his articles that were published there, and the delight I had as he wrote a responsive addendum to Collier's book. And when you get into the 4 pages, you can tell aged man and still very bright, reading my chapter and commenting slowly as he reads through it. And this had not been obviously anything mystical, had been extremely toned down if it was all there. The church fathers, he's focused on what they achieve in the confessions and in the commentaries on the confessions.
Right.
So there's plenty of in Athanasius that is not mystical. And so, that's sort of the orientation point. But it was there. And then to have him saying, by golly, you're right, Dr. Richardson, and I would really like to have many more conversations with you.
I wish I wasn't so
I couldn't have asked for a better response.
Yeah.
So with those kinds of points, we can open it up, or
so a couple of questions.
We can get more pointed to what you'd like me to.
Did you ever publish your doctorate?
I didn't.
Where can it be found?
Now you had to provide the university with 100 copies, and they would distribute it to various universities on their docket. So unfortunately, I didn't. Various people have culled it out of the microfiches or whatever they are,
right,
and used it in a dissertation here and there. I'm grateful for that.
So when you go to look, where do you go to look to refer to your dissertation?
I have my copy here, right. And so that's pretty much what I do. After I got excited about the contract with Baker on reading Karl Barth, New Directions for North American Theology, yes, which is still, it still does some things that the domestication of Barth by, I have to say, I love my Anglican friends, but his primary readers really worked hard on this. In spite of what William Plaker tried to counteract in his book on domestication. When I had a long conversation with William Plaker about my book and about the things that I wanted to highlight in there. For instance, Bruce McCormick had been a dear friend as a doctoral student as well. He came for a year to Basel to study the Reformed Orthodox in this gorgeous library of those books at Basel. And so he was coming off of his own pietistic background with the Nazarenes out at Point Loma College, and really loved the young Bart, totally rejecting pietism, which, you know, has since been kind of corrected by Christian Wynne, and overlooking the pietistic parts in Torrance, because they're very much there. The devotional Torrance is always speaking. And so what it was a joy for me was Torrance oriented me to particularly, as he would, you know, above all else, lift up church dogmatics 2:1 and the knowledge of God. And it would be only years later that I'd realized through Eberhard Jungel, as I worked on my book, how important then 2:2 was in terms of the shift in the doctrine of election, and how that then feeds everything else that happens. But it took the outstanding Lutheran theologian to highlight this. And then, but what I was fascinated by was that by the second volume, suddenly a Christ mysticism was coming into Barth, where he starts saying, no, Revelation isn't only the recollection of the church, but it is the presence of the risen Christ, so that you just have hundreds and hundreds of pages where this weaves through.
Yes.
Also, one of Barth's absolutely favorite loci in the gospel is wherever two or, Matthew 18, wherever two or more are gathered, there I am. This is the church. And of course, this was one of the watchwords of the early Reformation. And it is, and it's dogging the controversy with the Catholic Church, because this verse is repeated over and over in the canons of Trent. This cannot be a justification for ecclesial formation. And of course, the trying to counteract it. But in any case, it still is, we still suffer from the eclipsing of the radical Barth that perdures in the church dogmatics. It's not just the Romer Brief 1. So I think that the point at which I love to see in Torrance is the devoted theologian, the theologian writing in the living presence of Christ, and in whom are all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Because Torrance worked very hard at integrating his worldview and his view of Revelation. His systematic theological or his dogmatic theological work, like Eberhard Jungel, you don't really have a systematic theology, because as first generation Barthians, and in their own way post-Barthians, they also understand the Theologia Viatorum, the pilgrim theology. And Barth is saying, I don't want Barthians. I want you to simply read me and then continue on the path. In other words, dead theologians are dead. Their theology is not present to the author, and we are not present to the author. And so we need to pay attention that our sources, which have become historical theology, it's late 20th century, very, very early 21st maybe, but because Torrance, I forget the date of his death, but he's
2007.
there in some way.
Yeah.
And these are important features. And so that, and it's worth mentioning one huge other point. When I was in Boston, I got to know George Dragas, who was the professor of Orthodox theology at Holy Cross Orthodox Theological Seminary. And I got to know several of the colleagues there. And that was a very, very important time, because he was part of my circle of friends who received Torrance at Gordon Conwell Seminary, what was it, 1996? And we were, sort of Torrance's familiar friends, but George Dragas had worked, he had worked very closely.
Yeah.
Dragas was certainly instrumental in that dimension of Torrance's identity, which was Orthodox, which of course played into his ordination as a deacon of the Alexandrian Church. These are all dimensions of him that we need to cherish, because no one crossed over into Eastern Orthodoxy like Torrance did. Maybe the closest person would be someone like Rowan Williams, or one or other of the Anglican theologians, the very traditionalist Anglican theologians of that era.
Yeah.
They're very different now, what that means. But in any case, Torrance's embrace in those volumes with George Dragas of the Reformed Orthodox dialogue, and really represented it. Very, very important to understanding the later books on Trinitarian theology by Torrance, because the later books also tell us something about the ongoing influence of the earlier. Scientific theology, theology as science, is not all that apparatus that he created in that book. As important as it was at the time, you can get so complex, so systematic, that nobody else can use it. And yet Torrance was always learning, which is the other vital part of this, and therefore a true pilgrim theologian. And so he could shed armor that he didn't need anymore, and yet still he's doing scientific reasoning all the way along. Sometimes you can't figure out completely how he can continue to deny natural theology, until I got a really nice phrase from Eberhard Jungel, actually. Not natural theology, but a more natural theology.
And say more, what is the more about? I always talk about a theology of nature, that Torrance does the theology.
Exactly. And very much a good way of referring to that theology of nature.
Yeah.
So these different dimensions of Torrance, I love that. That's kind of my own experience as living as a confessionally grounded but open theologian, which is what I think a Christian has to be.
Yeah.
And recognizing that our roots in Rome are only and will only ever be part of the story.
Yeah.
Catholicity is just not defined by Rome, unless, as I've been kind of playing with recently, unless you acknowledge, in a sense, four Romes. Constantinople called itself the second Rome. Huh. And when it fell, Moscow called itself the third Rome. And somehow the Protestants are still very Roman, especially after scholasticism. So we are all, when, for instance, Roland Bainton famously calls the reformers hyper Augustinian. That keeps us, oh yeah, well then this is one of the Roman potentials.
Yeah.
And it's a correction from what happens after the Synod of Orange and ultimately Thomas Aquinas. And because now we're just bumping into Aquinians all over the place.
All over the place.
You know, and what we want to acknowledge here, however, too, is that Torrance cared very much about Barth's discussion of analogia entis. He cared very, very much about the problem of two theologians in history, Aquinas and Schleiermacher, of course.
Yes.
And that had to evolve, and it does, in some of the later collected essays on hermeneutics by Torrance. Still, he knows that natural theology in two types, and sometimes I think that sometimes it was a little oversimplified. I'm not sure. Torrance loved epochal reasoning and so on. And he often talked about nominalism and realism. And there was the medieval forms, and then there was the modern forms, the post-Reformation forms. So, you know, Aquinas represents one form, Schleiermacher represents another form. And he took very much to heart the Barth's polemics against Schleiermacher. And it was very difficult, I would say, in the final analysis to fully appreciate how much the polemics were simultaneous to learning from Schleiermacher, as we now know that Barth's Christology of the elected Son of God has elected for all men, reprobate for all humankind, elect for all humankind. Very Schleiermacherian, but redeemed or reconstructed, integrated. I mean, you know, in a way, when you're going to receive a controversial figure, because Barth himself is doing controversy all the way along, and Torrance is certainly very enamored with Barth's cutting against the grain over and over. So Schleiermacher is deeply embedded, and he has to be critiqued. And he, you know, like we often acknowledge, the closest relation, but with contradiction.
Yep.
Many times, like Barth and his interlocutors in the Reformed tradition, you know, sometimes Barth had to acknowledge in his old age he'd been too harsh. Nevertheless, by the time that some of this learning might have been happening in Torrance, he's so busy with orthodoxy, he's so busy with firsthand readings of the fathers, producing those new Trinitarian books. They go beyond the previous very, very interesting, almost liturgical exercises at the same time that they are dogmatic exercises. So those are some of the things that you know, maybe are worth mentioning.
Yeah, they are. And those will all inform our conversations as we go along. Carrie Magruder is kind of the librarian gatherer of information who runs the T.F. Torrance Fellowship website, and he teaches at the University of Oklahoma in history of science. He's a professor.
Oh, how great.
He takes
great.
people's doctorates like yours and digitalizes them so that they don't get lost merely in microfiche of years gone by. So if you'd be willing,
that's
I would
nice.
have Carrie get in contact with you and see about getting your work digitalized. Would you be up
That's
for that?
wonderful. I'd be very open to that. Sure.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
To everyone else, I'd also say, feel free to put questions in the chat
Yeah.
section there, and I'll bring them in as we go along. You did write the foreword to T.F. Torrance's book, which is called, what is that called? It's called Reality and Evangelical Theology. How did you come to be invited to write the foreword to that book?
Yeah. Well, I think it may have been a result of inviting him to speak at Gordon Conwell, having done my dissertation on him and staying in touch with him and in dialogue. So suddenly, I believe that's an InterVarsity book.
The one that you haven't done is published by Wolfenstock.
Oh, that's Whipped and Stock. Yeah. So they were suddenly contacting me and being told and telling me that that Torrance asked explicitly for me. So I'm very grateful for that.
The
And,
1982 form was published by InterVarsity, but the form that your forward is in was 2003
Yeah.
in the
Okay.
Wolfenstock form. Yep.
Yeah.
So they asked you, and I wonder, it was, see, Gary Detto was at InterVarsity, but he
Yes,
was
Gary Detto mediated that. Yes, it was very nice. And he's often said, anytime, Kurt, come on through here. And, I do a lot. I'm very widespread in my theological interests. And while I have the energy, I organize a lot of theological dialogue. And so one day when I can't move like this anymore, then maybe I'll write more than I have. But I have some good articles out there coming every year, and so I'm grateful for all of that.
Yeah.
This one, the one mistake that in that introduction that maybe it certainly irritated David Wells at the time when I said I thought that liberal theology was dying out. And but and I wanted to bring this up because obviously it has not died out. Is something very, very different than it was.
Right.
And it's hard to know, in the critique of neoliberalism, where liberalism even fits. But when I was in Boston, I also taught some for Boston Theological at university, and the whole Unitarian tradition. I experienced John Berthrong, who was the dean there at Boston University School of Theology, who was getting me to teach some. There were a lot of Unitarians that couldn't get a seminary education in New England, and Harvard was not really that Unitarian, not Unitarian at all, and it wasn't that as easy or as friendly, so they would go there. And the reason why I mention this is because liberal theology has often been, I saw a lot of it in the Southern Baptist orbit, and a lot of traumatized people who don't want to leave the church embrace liberal theology. Yeah. And we don't want to go into that too much, but we were seeing, in a sense, in the 80s, in the battle between the two continental Protestant theologians, Tillich and Barth had won. So, and we're still, basically seeing that. If you're into Tillich studies, you're kind of off in your little world. Whereas the Barth people transcend a lot, And as I mentioned before, Bart is very, very important in my conversations with Jewish and Muslim theologians. They're not only Jewish readers of Bart, but I've had a PhD student who did a dissertation at the University of Toronto on Bart and one of the Shia theologians.
Why do they find him interesting? What is the touch point?
Well, you want to know if I refer directly to David Novak, and David had some contacts with Torrance over the years. David is this modern Orthodox theologian. And I think modern Orthodoxy is a really good way, of describing it. I don't think as long, the two words are very helpful, rather than neo-Orthodox and also critical realistic theology is too long. And so in any case, what David Novak would emphasize is that here was a theologian who made sure that that the scripture itself was being exegeted. And it wasn't just theological exegesis, i.e. the confession dominating the exegesis, or proof texting, even worse. So it was they really, really respect the close reading of scripture that Bart did. And, years ago, Bernard Ram was one of the first to suggest to evangelicals they pay attention. And he compares him with Louis Sperry Chafer of Dallas Seminary, and how much more scripture Bart cites. This was very, very important to Torrance. That you always began again by a deep reading of scripture. And you weren't ready until you were also in the presence in some way. The inner testimony of the Holy Spirit is as important as it was to Calvin, could also make Calvin a pneumatological theologian, by the way. And Torrance got that point, and Torrance lived it in his own way. He was a fundamental part of the way he thought systematically as a Reformed theologian. Very beautiful. And this is what was inspiring to, I think, all of the theologians he ever met. By the late 20th century, you don't have the same kind of issues that liberal theology was plagued by at the turn of the 20th century. The controversy over Adolf von Harnack, whether or not he's actually a kind of atheist. Because it's the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man through Jesus Christ. Various things, everybody is interpreting how refined liberal theology became. But what we need to understand is all of that theology is how to do the hermeneutics of scripture in a civil religious context. Torrance never completely went there, I don't think, as a moderator of the Scottish Church, as just always in the orbit of the national clergy mentality. But, Bonhoeffer really does have to talk about religionless Christianity. And liberal theology, when your job is not at stake, is just not that important. In other words, the state church, you don't want to fall afoul of them, which, from time to time, in my early career, there were a couple of really big problems in Germany for one or two New Testament theologians that were transferred into some other department of their universities, but expelled from their theological schools. And the most famous, of course, though, is Hans Küng and his expulsion from the State University of Tübingen, Theological Faculty of the Catholics, Sacred Theology, you're gone. That's what liberal theology was for. How to account for every element of the tradition and think differently about it. One can think, for instance, in the late 90s, when Robert Jensen was presenting his magnum opus at the end of his career, his systematic theology. There were a lot of Torrancians and Bartians involved in there, like Paul Molnar. And I'll never forget Paul Molnar just reading the riot act to Robert Jensen on his chapter on resurrection, which was just pure Boltzmannian. And his excuse was, well, what else can we do scientifically but have a kind of the resurrection is the rising of the crucified Christ in the worship of the community. How can it be any other way? And it's very interesting because Robert was otherwise post-liberal. And in fact, he comes to define post-liberalism for Lutheran theologians, mainline Lutheran theologians, and they finally have to start a new church. But on this one, and I remember he appeals, help me guys, how do I rewrite this chapter? Of course, he never rewrote it. And it was
Molnar
so
would have
strange.
probably helped him.
Yeah, that's right.
I can see Paul doing that.
And yeah, oh yeah, very definitely. Insofar as you can stand it, Paul has been the anomaly, among his Roman Catholic colleagues.
Yeah.
There were plenty of Bartian Catholics, not a whole lot of Torrancian Catholics, although Torrance, I'm sure, appreciated it. And it is curious how, as Paul Molnar had to contribute to some degree to the anti-Vatican II. He probably would not like me saying it so crassly, or the question on Vatican II, because Ronert plays such a big role there. And he attacks Ronert so viciously for his the ontological trinity is the economic trinity and vice versa. And I'm not sure how much Torrance appreciated that. Paul took it to the most detailed critical level I've almost ever seen in recent theology. Polemical
He has
theology,
a very sharp mind.
but polemical theology to the hilt with someone who I would not call Ronner a liberal theologian. So, but that's a whole other area that I do think is important, because in 1997 to 98, I was a visiting professor in the Faculty of Theology at Marburg. And that was an important time for me. And echoes of Torrance were in my work there as well. But, it was I got to know Hans Martin Barth, no relation to Karl, but Hans Martin was the lead Protestant theologian in the Lutheran Catholic agreement on justification. And of course, Torrance was very, very strict about the doctrine of justification. He again had a lot of similarities, or Jungel had a lot of similarities with that commitment, and Jungel was the odd man out. Although if you're the biggest man on the block, then that's pretty important. And writing his book on justification, which is basically an appeal for that sola fide does not allow for compromises on justification by faith alone. So that's those are very, very interesting avenues of theological conversation. But the liberalism issue, I'm also very interested in a kind of theology of atheism. And if we think about Barth on, like David Friedrich Strauss, on Nietzsche, Torrance, like Barth, is a proclaimer's theologian. He is an ecclesial theologian. He wants the science of theology always to be a science of the people of God in Christ. And so you have that. But Torrance doesn't talk as much about the theological reasons of atheists. But I think he is, insofar as Barth's rejection of natural theology is rooted in what he called the sacrificium intellectum, that even after all the proofs for God's existence, you have built nothing of the bridge to the gospel. And so you're still being asked to leap over this chasm of special revelation, which is really the determinant for any talk of God and the knowledge of God by God's self-disclosure in Christ. So there's nothing else to talk about from nature. And so
with regards to God, you can talk about nature in regards to nature. I mean,
you talk about what?
Science. You can talk about nature with regard to nature, but you can't talk about it with regards to God. In other words, there's still a place for natural science to do its investigative work.
That's right. And Torrance is very, very big on Barth's principle of unilateral revelation. It doesn't go in two directions. And then the most important part of the because is because revelation is grace from first to last. Mm-hmm. I also, in my dissertation, try to highlight that dictum of Torrance's, God's being is God's act, God is identical to his act and his being. And this is kind of heyday material in Torrance. This is where Torrance is really shining for the English language theological community. And shortly after I did that dissertation, and actually at a very early theology conference at Wheaton College, where I met Gary Dedeaux and presented on these matters, and George Hunsinger was there. And it's like we will end up going into this argument over Eberhard Jungel, and a slightly different kind of argument with Torrance. But he's just becoming a post-liberal, George Hunsinger himself, and becoming obviously the very, very avid reader of Barth that he has become, and yet very ecumenical. His Yale years, along with Bill Plaker's, like George Lindbeck. George Lindbeck will tell you, I'm not very good at Barth because I'm not very good at scripture. Huh. And I know his daughter, Chris Lindbeck, very dear person, and a professor of the Jewish interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. Anyway, George Lindbeck, like a lot of moderate liberal theologians, Hans Frey is there in their background. And Hans Frey is doing something in the Yale School that Torrance is not really finding that much traction with. And we can understand that. The Yale School, though, is the post-liberal place. And so I want to give, some credit to Hunsinger. He, I think, ended up, he called Torrance's theology a little bit soporific. years ago at Wheaton. But years later, he would extol him and credit Torrance with mediating Barth at a time in English language theology when Tillich was just everything. And he had soured on Tillich. Lots of people were souring on Tillich by the end of the 20th century. And where to go? There had been so much anti-Barth polemic, they had to dig through a lot. And see, the Anglicans were appreciating Barth through Torrance and others, Colin Gunton, one of his students, and yet that Anglican context was doing something very different than the Reformed context with Barth. And so the ecumenical stuff fit in okay, the Reformed and Orthodox dialogue, but it was still this Scottish theologian speaking to us. And as I try to, in some ways, unfortunately, expose, I had known John Webster from years and years earlier in Cambridge at Tyndale House, very important place for the evangelicals at Cambridge. And because I had gone to Trinity, D.A. Carson had been a fixture there, and I would do the bibliography for my prof's book, Harold Brown on Heresies, at that place. And so I always had a strong Cambridge tie. Also years later to David Ford, who also had a great appreciation for Barth. But they had to wrestle Barth into an Anglican mode. And my book, which suddenly I realized I did not know I was going to be pitting Jungel against his greatest interpreter in the English language, John Webster, and actually, mangling or ignoring Jungel and in some of his most sincere reception of Barth all the way through CD 4.4. Now, CD 4.4 is too much for Torrance. And in my book, in other words, discard infant baptism because, well, let's be clear, because first of all, because of responsible exegesis, which Jungel is for, but the conversation between Barth and his son, Marcus. And I had Marcus when I was a student at Basel in lectures on Romans, so good. And Marcus Barth had paid very, very dearly for doing a New Testament exegetical work on the doctrine of baptism. That's a whole other story, but it's a very important part of Barth's story behind 4.4, which has that conversation. And then also he has this reference in the little introduction to that book, which says maybe my Catholic colleagues at Vatican II will actually do the work on this that I would like to see my church do. It maybe seem like I'm going out on a very bad note here, but I think in the end that it's the right thing to do. Well, Webster tries to say, actually this volume is inferior, it's late in life, and it shouldn't have been published together with the rest. And there was even a movement at one time to try to expel it and make it a kind of secondary published thing, separate published thing, and that was not tolerated. But running roughshod over Eberhard Jungel, who is not too old, as he writes major works on that volume, and then on the whole of the church dogmatics and the shift in the doctrine of election, and particularly John Webster's emphasis on Barth and ethics, which was very helpful. But, it's all integrated in Barth, as well as Christ is the one and only sacrament.
Yeah.
So these are things that Torrance himself, they just stick in the craw. And for whatever reason, I mean, one of the things that I would observe on sacraments and is that in 1.1 and 1.2 of the Church Dogmatics, Barth has a kind of Calvinistic, not Zwinglian. And boy, an awful lot of the world has become Zwinglian. Although Zwingli doesn't become a Paedobaptist, or sorry, doesn't abandon Paedobaptism, he is ripe for it. And Barth just sort of ends up going the whole way. This is intolerable for an Anglican, and we see this in what I had to kind of expose in my chapter, basically on Webster and Jungel. But Torrance is not going to deal with all of that. He dealt with it in his own way. He was faithful to his church and his tradition, and this leads him to work out, his own very positive theological reasons here. And I think for infant baptism and the tradition, and that remains something which I think George Hunsinger had his own way of trying to resolve that, mostly in conversation with the Catholic Bardians, and this really some of these really crazy things that were said. For instance, that Hans Urs von Balthasar received Barth's confession of union with the Catholic Church on his close to his last day of life. Stuff that was that's just kind of crazy. And if you don't read Barth as a Roman Catholic, there's really no use for Barth. So Paul Molnar was not in very many of those conversations, I don't think. He had a hard time, I think, resisting them, because if in fact the reading of Barth is more appropriately like Torrance's and Jungel's, then that's a steep hill to climb for the Roman Catholics if you don't embrace the heart and soul of the council and move forward from there. There are plenty of theologians that are now a little bit emboldened because of Francis I. We'll see where that leads.
Yeah.
We need Torrance also as someone who remembered World War II, someone who remembered the nationalistic appropriation of theology. He did not play with that reality very much, but he certainly was a good Scots Reformed theologian who mourned what the war had done, what it had done to the Jewish the Jewish communities of Europe, and if he'd lived now, who knows what he would be saying. But those are some other aspects that I think are valuable.
So I have a question.
Torrance in his context.
A question from Dwayne. Can you speak about McCormick's New Christology and what important direction you see it going and how it relates to Torrance?
Well, I'm just working through it myself, and we have a lot of work to do on it by November. One of the most important thing, maybe the most important thing about Bruce McCormick started coming out a decade ago in his emphasis on the freedom of God to be what God will be. I think Torrance believed in that. I think Torrance believed in the fundamental freedom of God to be whom God will be. If we read all that he has to critique about Aquinas. This does touch upon the problem of natural theology in the deepest or highest ontological sense, that God is not controlled by any law of his being above his being. God is being in act in being, and God is I will be whom I will be. And Torrance is also living in the milieu that Barth's radical ideas, while being very committed to orthodoxy. This is the genius of Barth and the courage of Barth to scrap christliche Theologie and to start over again, and to do Anselm, which is embraced very, very deeply by Torrance. So what does all of that mean? That means that once he reads the biblical canonicism of Bruce McCormick, he's going to be thinking like Isaac Dorner in his book on divine immutability, which is like Calvin in chapter 13 of book 1 of the Institutes. These are very, very radical, very, very biblical and Reformed Orthodox treatises. They mean a very, very great deal that for the sake of the New Testament apostolic witness, at the end of his career, Calvin would say, the aseity of the Son has to be affirmed. And so while we affirm the eternal procession of the Son, we reject the eternal generation of the Son. Oh, it took me a long time to just kind of sort this out. Very, very important. And Isaac Dorner, immutability is divine reliability. It is not that the ontology of the divine cannot cope with change. Now, Torrance will not go in the direction, and neither will Bruce McCormick, go in the direction that some of Moltmann's panentheism, although Moltmann doesn't really want to say I'm panentheistic. He wants deeper scriptural reasons. Does he get there? Well, this is that experimental part that Torrance is also an expert at and loves, and so is Barth. Just carry the tradition with you, but remember that scripture is the norma normans, not the norma normata, which, in a sense, when you're overruled by the creed, you've lost the principle of the Reformation, the semper reformatum, which is something I emphasize in my own work and reading on Barth, so much so that I came to this conclusion: read Barth, read the church dogmatics in a sense, imaginatively from back to front, so that you are not threatened by the incapacity to scholasticize Barth, which also calls into question the scholasticization of Aquinas. But I mean, Aquinas is trying to be a scholastic. But in any case, Dorner is giving to Barth too, and then ultimately to Torrance, and I would say also to McCormick, the freedom to think freely about the God who freely discloses, creates and discloses himself, discloses God's self, and that freedom to be whom God will be, based upon relationality and promissory truth, which is the nature of divine self-communication exhibited to the human being through creation and the grace that is all revelation, if it's revelation. What should stop a lot of people short, including George Hunsinger, who really does not, I mean, this is sort of this has been this open conflict at Princeton Theological Seminary, having tied there. The BART wagon in the English language is Princeton Seminary, or what? In any case, the irritant.
There's some people in Aberdeen that are.
Yeah.
Not,
well, okay, but the BART Center is massively better funded at Princeton. So, someday, so my favorite antiquarian bookstore is in Basel, on Klebeckstrasse in Klein Basel, and just gems that I was able to pick up there, and another place right near the Spallentor in Basel City, in the old part of town next to the university, called Rote Hahn, which is no longer there, and the Red Rooster. Anyway, by the time I got there, most of my Reformed 17th and 18th century books were of later Orthodox, but I have like the whole Synopticon of Matthew Poole, which is pretty neat, and a first edition of Gomarus and a first edition of Peter Maastricht. I'm looking across the room at them. Anyway, these traditions of orthodoxy and yet modernity are what typify Torrance and what typifies Bruce McCormick. And what I was about to say about giving pause, Bruce knows how to exegete the Bible. Bruce spends a lot of time exegeting Philippians 2. And he is grounding his theology in good exegesis. So before we fly off the handle at him in defense of the divine attributes and the supposed control of the divine being by the divine attributes, I mean, but there were, I would say, almost anthropological reasons why a lot of theology desperately holds to the classical traditions of theism. So I'll never forget, though, the way in which one of my favorite references in Barth to regarding the rejection of natural theology, and this is not highlighted enough, is that Barth, very quickly, and I think you see this in the 19th century theology book, Barth says, hey, don't forget that natural theology is a product of the concept of natural religion. It's an Enlightenment paradigm that deism, etc., engineers, and we still have that all the way down through John Hick and lots of people. In fact, if you know Anglicans well, and the crisis of Anglican Christianity in the Anglo world of England. Civil religion is more important in practice, and waiting around for a coronation or a royal wedding is more important than the body of believer, than the consensus fidelium. So the Anglicans are expert at civil Christianity. And how many ways? But in the end, these traditions had to be left behind. And the Barmen Declaration, I think, reflects that. And just the moving, the forced moving on from what the Germans call the Volkskirche, the People's Church. And Torrance was very, very cautious about that regarding his church. But, and he enjoyed being moderator, no doubt about that. And what he would think today about Edinburgh, where Bruce was at the beginning of his career, I have no, it's hard to imagine, and I don't think we're supposed to imagine it. We acknowledge the indebtedness. I know Bruce McCormick, when I was doing my dissertation, he would just extol Torrance as like, well, thank God for a faithful, highly refined, Reformed theologian in the English language. And so what we will be getting is the embrace, based on the profound historical tradition of revelation as condescension of the divine being. What does that condescension mean? Condescension unto death. And whatever canonicism did in the 19th century, it was an insight. Just like the Christ as the elect human being is Schleiermacher's insight. And Barth critiques the context of Schleiermacher, but sees the insight in it, and he takes it on a whole new, he appropriates it in a whole new venue that is deeply grounded in the profound theology of revelation that he had. Torrance has that, and Bruce is practicing that. We'll see what you think. But those are some of my first.
I have a question, Dr. Richardson.
Please.
One way or another, it seems to me that what you're talking about in this effort to, solve an impasse maybe between Barth and the modern world. And I'm thinking of the Barth-Brunner debate on the point of contact, or the Anknüpfungspunkt.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask you, how would you see that point of contact addressed, and can you do that without pneumatology?
Good question. I love that question. You can tell that Torrance loves Brunner. He doesn't have much time for him because he doesn't need to really make too much time. I mean, how many people are going to read Brunner when you can read Barth? And yet we need to always remember the German context, the original German reception of Brunner called it Missionstheologie, missionary theology. The Anknüpfungspunkt is not in reference to the deists. It's not in reference to Enlightenment theology. It's not in reference to whatever Reimarus wanted and others like him. And so why does Barth take Schleiermacher to task over that? that's a whole other subject. But if Barth is going to adopt a Christological paradigm that becomes fundamental to his own Christological paradigm, and Barth and Torrance, they want to use good insights wherever they can find them. And I am unabashedly in their camp, in their, way back with the troops, but I'm marching with them. And so Torrance is trying to suggest, for instance, later on, a kind of Christologically grounded natural theology, or theology of nature. And once he kind of has found that, he takes it as far as he can. He's very busy late in the last 2 decades of his writing period. He's spread out all over the place and doing competent work, doing good work. So, and like I mentioned, it's kind of like Jungel learning the same in German and talking about a more natural theology, a natürlichere Theologie, but rejecting natural theology.
Yeah.
Kein natürliche Theologie, sondern natürlichere Theologie. I think that's really nice. And Torrance would like that. On pneumatology, good question. Torrance is absolutely consistent. Without the lens provided by Christ, and therefore always by the Holy Spirit, it's not an Anknüpfungspunkt. So on the other hand, here's where the proclaimer, the scripture, the preacher Torrance, there's a preacher Barth and there's a preacher Torrance, and you testify to the glory of God. You testify to the existence of a revelation in him, in Christ. And so, but you don't try to build a bridge, you don't try to help people see a bridge that isn't there. And of course, for Barth, there are phrases which, there's a paradigm that almost you, in the first volume of the Church Dogmatics, where you're almost, there's no revelation anywhere else. What's really going on here? And then later, when Barth can talk about the lesser lights of the world religions, what does he mean by that? Are those Anknüpfungspunkte? But of course, Barth will always be a survivor of 2 world wars. Particularly, the reason why he takes the missionary theology of Brunner to task as if it's no better than liberal theology, which is sunk in analogia entis and is providing resources for the Arianization of Christian theology, which we didn't realize how bad it really was. You've got to really get into you've got to get into Kittel at the time and others. And it takes Susanna Heschel's book on the Arian Christ to really uncover some of this and how conservative theologians could get into it. And see, Brunner had been a part of the world of Zwischen den Zeiten, the early Word of God theology is my preferred. Sometimes you hear radical theology, whatever. But Word of God could encompass the young Bultmann as well as the young Brunner and the young Barth. And so here there is a view of the Spirit that Barth is going to criticize, a kind of Schleiermacherian general spirit of the speeches. And I think, one of the things that's very interesting about the reception of the pneumatology of Schleiermacher is that, the speeches are not dogmatics really in any way at all. They are civil religion and at the beginning of Romanticism. And it's a little bit tiresome, actually. There's this strong aesthetic, of course, in Schleiermacher's speeches. But, in the end, he's still scolding the modern despisers for having no spirituality, And it's kind of, it's really vapid. And, going from that early turn of the 19th century to von Harnack, turn of the 20th, and what are we really working with here? But in terms of theological substance, but Barth is also a student of Wilhelm Hermann, who is the teacher of the likes of Bultmann, that would put them into the same room together, onto the same journal together. And there's so much that Reformed theology is still defending itself on. We're still in the Reformation, in a sense. And so about 15 years ago, when David Bentley Hart wrote his book on the beauty of the infinite, which is a really, really, really interesting book. And George Hunsinger asked me to stand up and drive the spear through him. And the problem was that he's so orthodox in terms of, the Eastern Orthodox theological heritage, that everything was Christologically centered. And I thought, oh my goodness, here's the one breakthrough that can happen at any time. And see, in the ill success of the speeches of Schleiermacher, and given a few decades, Schleiermacher is going to write the Christian Faith. And the Christian Faith is really the first book of neo-orthodoxy. It's not liberal theology, because it's insistent upon every doctrine in the tradition. Now, you can say, oh, there's still a lot of reinterpretation. Yes, but it's not what later liberal theology does. And so there were so many theologians that used the speeches as a kind of hermeneutic on how, if there's still too much orthodoxy in the Christian faith, just interpret it through the speeches and keep demythologizing. In a way, what happens in Bultmann can be traced all the way back to this reading strategy. But natural theology is the bugbear for so many Protestant theologians. How much of it do we want? How much of it don't we? Why would we want it? Why would you want it, for instance? Because in a world full of religion, natural theology is just so thin. And again, the Torrance is any of that going to be present in Bruce? No way. Is any of that going to be present in any construal of Torrance's wanting a more natural theology, a theology of nature. No, and he's maybe modest about how he refers to the Holy Spirit, that Torrance, that is, but it's there epistemologically everywhere. And he would, never the Word without the Spirit, and the Spirit without the Word. So he would want, there's no need for an Anknüpfungspunkt because all the other doctrines are at play, and the responsibility of the theologian is always to be Christologically, and which presupposes pneumatologically grounded. Like the first thing we should be going to is, the creation of God in Christ, and the problems of liturgy, of the details, clergy theology. Let's always preach the gospel, and the gospel can help us cover a lot of ground very quickly, so that we're not in two minds. And at least that's my reading of Torrance.
Okay. So I'm thinking that a fruitful way to get into this subject would be looking at the history of practical theology in America, because practical theology started out the 20th century very optimistic about engineering the democracy of God. You could create a society through science and technology, and you could link that with democracy and industrial capitalism. You could usher in the Christian century, and that whole paradigm started hitting the fan in 1914.
Right.
Jan. And there was a very significant essay written by a man named Shelton Smith. Should religious educators reckon with the Bartians? And there was a very strong disagreement among the liberals versus the Bartians in the religious education movement. Meetings almost came to fisticuffs. But the Bartians could not figure out how to relate Barth to the great significance that the sciences had brought into religious education through psychology and sociology and things like that. They couldn't figure out how to relate those things. And that Barthian reckoning sort of petered out in the 50s and 60s. But
that's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up. A number of points from Torrance come to mind here. Some bright, some not so bright. So not so bright in terms of his estimation of American theology, which is tragic. But in other words, when Elmer Collier went to Dubuque after the retirement of Donald Blesh was a very dear friend of mine, and he had tremendous appreciation for Barth. This was before McCormick went to Princeton, or barely there, and or I should say joined the faculty. He was already there as a PhD student under I'll think of his name in a minute, but anyway, longtime professor.
Dewey?
Torrance did not, sorry?
Edward Dewey?
Ed Dewey, yeah, not Ed Clowney.
Yeah.
Torrance did not have much to say about the Princeton theological faculty in the 80s and 90s. And he said about Collier, well, maybe Dubuque is one of the few Presbyterian seminaries with some serious dogmatic theology being taught at it. So that was, and I thought, whoa, the American landscape is not impressing dear Papa Torrance very much here. On the other hand, you have these moments in Torrance's work where he reminisces on conversations that he's had with the aging Barth. And, there are conversations about two things. Theology as Science a la Torrance, and the bodily resurrection. And Torrance really lays into this point that he detected something in the exposition of the doctrine of the resurrection that could leave open a little bit the mythology rather than the physical realism, physical reality of the resurrection. And in fact, the whole critical realistic thing is certainly in a way almost terminating on the bodily resurrection, if only to be fully Pauline, right? If Christ is not raised, our faith is in vain. So, so you have these conversations, and sometimes I think even in the way that this enthusiasm, you know, what we referred to earlier, almost the childlike enthusiasm, which I absolutely love. I think it's a posture. You know, he who enters the kingdom of God, he or she who enters the kingdom of God must first of all become like a child. And if you're starting over every morning, then you're in a little bit of a rebirth every day. Anyway, thank God for the mercy of Christ. So in any case, the Europeans, I think, first of all, as the child of missionary parents to China, you know, he has a very different perspective on the world, and he returns to Scotland, and he's never, though, overly Scottish. He loves Edinburgh, he loves New College, but it's not something going on, except through the Scottish theologians that he likes, or philosophers. So, and there's the Scottish realism kind of pushing in a way that Bart doesn't feel you need to push. But you do see it when Bart visits, of course, North America, and Carl F.H. Henry is just zeroing in on that and wants to know about the photographability of the resurrection. You know, and it's really delightful. And see, this also belongs to the conservative side of natural theology. And I think, you know, Torrance looks for, in his lifetime, the Americans to get beyond the polemics of fundamentalism and modernism. And the evangelicals don't seem to be able to do that very well. And I certainly experienced that when I taught at Gordon Conwell. It's kind of like Westminster Theological Seminary, where they just have to cull heresy every 5 years, or they just don't feel like they're being faithfully reformed. And so now we're down to one of the interesting points that I would say typify Torrance's Scottish Reformed theological position.
Let me
Pastor, if I could just state,
okay.
Yeah, just state this. This is important. And that is Torrance's, I don't know whether to call it notorious, rejection of the Westminster Confession.
Okay.
In favor of the Scots, etc., the earliest of the confessions, vehemently. And the more things went on, because slowly the American style is an heir to some of the Dutch style and to some of the more strident in both in the British Isles, in Great Britain. But they were pretty small groups. Kuyper's bunch, you know, they won half the Dutch Reformed Church, and that was operative at Westminster Theological Seminary and the creation of it. And we need to understand that if you believed with Machen and Van Til, I don't remember if there are any references to Van Til's Bart books. I don't think Torrance could bear to read them.
Yeah, probably not.
You know, if Bart saw a ghost of himself in them, I can only imagine what kind of refuse Torrance was ready to consign those books to, refuse pile. But in any case, so once you have Princeton being fled by Machen's company as apostate, all of the evangelicals at Princeton, and certainly the vast majority in the 20s, are evangelical, and they celebrate Bart. Also Bruner, I would say, probably, but they're some of the best American readers of Bart. And Westminster forecloses the possibility of the separatist evangelicals from anything like a positive reception on Bart. And this is in other places. So I remember a horrible book by the German Canadian theologian that I can't remember his name right now. Oh, that he had Klaus Bockmuehl. This book was never translated into English, but it's basically on the atheism of Karl Barth, and it is kind of Van Til on steroids. And Bockmuehl is was the father of Marcus Bockmuehl, who's very responsible Oxford New Testament scholar. You know, I mean, very different from the father, but driven by apologetics. And apologetics, which Torrance had a very healthy suspicion of rejection of. This was the conservative natural theology. And, you know, we now have these ridiculous, hyper immutability assertions about the Trinity and about God and so on. And so, and the Catholics have a lot of this too. So what was once a kind of liberal conservative divide, the conservatives have a whole other set of problems. And, you know, I do want to go back to, or I do want to mention one thing that Torrance was very well aware of. And that was so much continuing rejection of Barth, even at the end of his career as a full-time professor. On the day, I was at Marcus Barth's Abschiedsrede at Basel. And it was a lovely occasion. It's the farewell address of an emeritus professor, who is going to be an emeritus professor. And when Barth did his in the late 50s, the Burgermeister of Basel, now this is after Barth has gone on record immediately wanting the Swiss Christians to reconcile with the German Christians. Like, what are you doing, Barth? Well, he's being a pastor. He's doing practical theology. And he immediately reaches out to them. And in my book, I have an untranslated vision statement that Barth has about the risen Christ speaking to these surviving Germans that have taken themselves to zero. So if you want that, it's out of this huge untranslated book by Eberhard Busch on Barth and the Jews.
Okay.
Anyway, and Barth is told, and then Barth has also said he will not be anti-communist just because the conservative Christians of America and elsewhere think that their atheism and their system is the most evil ever devised. He would not enter in on condemning the Soviet use of atomic weaponry and kind of semi-blessing the Western use of it. So he comes to the day of his retirement, and the mayor of Basel says barely anything, but to introduce the distinguished professor as, well, I guess I have to say that Herr Barth has been a great disappointment to all of us.
Gee.
How do you even go and give your speech? Well, the joyful theologian did not lose his joy, and Torrance never lost his joy. So Torrance believed in scientific theology for everyone, which meant completely grounded in scripture from first to last, but with insights on nature. And he had that way of talking about, like, even Orthodox Christology and in icons, and how the dais opened up rather than opened down.
Yeah.
And this implied that everything in the knowing of the theologian leads him, once he or she has the insight of all things in Christ, the whole cosmos opens up. Its intelligibility is unfailingly available because it reflects the providential creator. And these constructs, epistemological constructs, are his way of doing a more natural theology as a Christian theologian, as a believer. He often refers to the captivity of his mind to Christ. And that if his reasoning is compelling to a historian of science at the University of Oklahoma, that's wonderful. He's confident in something like, I would say, what would we call it? The general covenant of God with creation. But it can only be tapped into Christologically.
Yeah.
Anyway, you were about to show a book.
Well, I just wanted to let you know that Torrance did have a strong relationship with one faculty member at Princeton. He wrote the foreword to this book, The Knight's Move.
Oh, wow.
The relational logic of spirit in science and theology.
Cool.
And his foreword doesn't appear on Torrance bibliographies that I've read. But he had a very favorable understanding of what Loder was trying to do. Loder wrote this. James Loder was the professor, and Neidhart was a physicist from the New Jersey Institute of Technology.
Right. Yeah.
And so the book makes a case for integration of the natural world and the world of Christ through the analogia spiritus. And what he meant by that is that there is a similarity and a dissimilarity between the human spirit and its ability to create in science or art or therapy, and the human spirit in conversion. And then the Holy Spirit redemptively transforms that creative capacity. So it's based on a strong, I call it Neo-Chalcedonian science or Neo-Bardian science.
Yeah, and there is a lot of that. He wants to, but this is where I would say, instead of a natural theology, he is developing an anthropology, a theological anthropology.
Yeah.
What is the human being doing that like what is Albert Einstein doing? Some of Torrance can get almost a little naive, and I would say that applies to the way he can, in a way, theologize about the scientist by the name of Albert Einstein. He is enamored, for instance, with the sort of epoch-making the epistemological epoch that turns on relativity theory. And an awful lot of people either picked up on that or work with that epochal difference. For instance, Pannenberg is not really moving along with all of this. But I had early on, and I was part of, for at least a decade, I was part of the invited scholars in the Templeton Foundation orbit. And Torrance was a big part of Templeton's visioning there and the Center for Theological Inquiry. Torrance had a big role to play in the development of that institution, and so many have benefited from that center. And that's where I got to know Daniel Hardy, who
That's
was
where
a
Loder
partner.
met. That's where Loder met Torrance
Yeah,
at
yeah.
CTI.
There we are. And so, but Torrance had a pretty consistent way of shifting the ground. Instead of this connecting you with God, instead it demonstrates the ineradicable connectedness of the human being to the Creator, and that can only be interpreted Christologically. But Torrance took it as far as he possibly could, and yet he's really more, as I said, anthropological and then liturgical. And so theology is also praise. It is not an argument. It is not evidentialism. It is not, he had various, it is not necessitarianism. He would often use that word. And I always went around looking for the necessitarians. But anyway, it was his delight in research, in the fruits of science and the nature of the human being. So that's where he's rhapsodic. That's where he's almost poetic. And it's actually a strategy. It's a heuristic.
Yeah.
And that meant something to Barth. It's why Barth can say, I Hegelianize without being Hegelian. Because that's the form of the discourse. And so one of the most interesting readers of Torrance has been Alistair McGrath.
Yes.
And, he's Anglican, and in some ways then moves on. And that's a little disappointing. But he also moved on from his early, very, very strong Reformation theology base. It's been interesting to watch other post-Barthians. Of course, the left wing of the post-Barthians appear very early in the Death of God movement. And Van Buren for instance, doesn't stay there. And this is one of the problems for the Barthian reception in the shadow of Tillich and existentialism. And really what was the second generation existentialism, which is postmodernism, the dividing up of Europe between the horribly shameful self-destruction the Europeans put themselves through, the level of collaboration that can't be talked about. The fact, for instance, that the entire conservative Dutch Reformed National Church basically became Nazi. Can't talk about it. That Abraham Kuyper's son was one of the founders, as one of the leading professors of Free University of Amsterdam, and that Kuyper's grandson joined the SS, Waffen-SS in 1943, and dies for Hitler on the Eastern Front.
Is that right? Wow.
Because there is no third way, like the French have, there is no resistance, other than a few communists in Holland. The separatism of the church, which was so celebrated, even by those who didn't like the nationalism and didn't go along with it. But when you realize that, that orbit, which, Kuyper's son infamously declares that Hitler is, during this period of the war, the sovereign of Holland, of the Netherlands. They would have approved of summary execution of the Ten Boom family, which was routinely done by the SS whenever a Dutch family during wartime was found harboring Jews. Maybe they could have gone to prison, but this is the horrible unspoken reality of post-World War II Europe, and this is why the national churches are just defunct in the eyes of the young generation. And postmodernism is the attempt to deconstruct the narrative, the theological narratives, the political theological narratives that made that all possible. That if you're so afraid, based on natural theology or public theology, if you're so afraid of the atheism of Marxism, and then you run into the arms of religious fascism, what kind of alternative was that?
Yeah.
And the Americans cannot imagine what that was. And then the other form of postmodernism is how to talk freely under Soviet control in the East Bloc, and it's largely a product of East Berlin. None of those things pertain to us. And Torrance is a surviving generation and is trying to help his church move forward. He's delighted with all the Americans that want to come and study with him, just like the Swiss were. I was probably the last generation of American evangelicals going to Basel in a big way. I come in 1983, and there are at least a dozen or more of us. And by 1989, very few are coming. Where American theology has found its voice, whatever that is, those things are, whatever those voices are. But like Thomas Oden, who loved Torrance, especially the later Torrance, who's reading, so he's doing paleo theology better than Thomas Oden. Anyway, which is, those two books on the Trinity, in a way are paleo theology, and just brilliantly done. But Torrance is looking at the aftermath of fundamentalism and among the evangelicals and wondering, where are you? I'm trying to help seed modern orthodoxy in my national church. And at that time, obviously, the Presbyterian Church USA, and all the evangelicals can do is keep on fighting or turn to apologetics. And he would see us as very bereft of confessional control, what that really means anymore. So
you'd appreciate a little anecdote. When I was at Fuller Seminary,
yeah,
I was completely
with Ray
ignorant.
Anderson.
I did have conversations with him. I didn't take him, but I had actually conversations.
Lawrence loved him.
And one of his students, Andrew Root, has become a very good theologian of youth and family ministries. But when I was at at Princeton, we were assigned to read Karl Barth in the systematics class,
Oh, wow.
and I found him devotional. It was just so rich
Definitely.
for me, and I had
Yeah.
the same experience of joy and here's something I can really that really means something. But
That's right.
but my professor, Colin Brown, said the only thing you could say about Barth, and he said this in the last lecture, the only thing you could say about Barth was you could sing Bob Hope's Thanks for the Memories.
Oh,
I could not
And,
figure out how he
you
could
know,
get to that conclusion.
well, and he had the Anglican natural theology bent, whereas Jeffrey Bromley obviously didn't.
Yeah.
But you just didn't hear, Jeffrey was a transplanted Brit. And this has been a problem ever since the battle for the Bible at Fuller. And just the furthering deeper fissures and divisions and the militancy that should define us and the fear that, and now, the balls, but it's a very, very troublesome time because we don't know what church discipline is anymore. Maybe it's not, there's so much politicization right now, and it's everywhere, and it's political theology. It's not just politics. And so the problem, like the early 17th century that leads to the horrible division in Dort, and on the eve of the 30 Years' War, and is only relieved by the laymen taking over their nobility, but they're just going, look, this much political theology is a fight to the death and self-destruction. And in a different mode, it happens all over again with Hitler and the self-baptizing of the bishops who align with him. So these are very, 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 very serious problems. The UK is removed, has always kind of pretended to be removed from that and above that. So that, one of Colin Gunton's closest colleagues, Oliver O'Donovan, he writes like, either the Anglican tradition can become the Catholic Church for England that it should be, or everybody will meet in this royal middle, and the Holocaust is never even mentioned, in the Desire of the Nations. A lot of political theology out there, and it's part of what typifies a certain form of natural theology that Barth was extremely allergic to.
Yeah, a lot of idolatry and blasphemy, I would say.
Actually, yeah. And people I've known who have given their life to ministry and are either caught up in it or cannot afford to speak against it. And so thinking our way through as kingdom people, for a long, long time, the pietism, the Volkskirche, and then the pietists, it's a false dichotomy and a reduction of the church in both counts. The big church is the national church, and therefore civil religion. And God's little flock needs to put up and shut up and be a little pious desires coterie and church within the church. And neither of them are churches, but this is what we are forced to get used to. And Rome can't let go of Rome. So this is why Theologia Viatorum and semper reformandum is so important. And I think Bruce's book is his life work attempting to do that, because it's one of 3 volumes that he's working on.
So I think I'm gonna say, we could go on all day. You are a library
it's
of
fun.
stories and
It's
information
just
and
fun to
threads in time and
it's
history.
my
and-
life, and I hope it's helpful in some way. And Marty, thank you for the invitation.
Yes,
Yeah, we're already 2 hours into this, so
you've taken
that,
us
I
through
didn't
time and
have
space and
the
history.
good sense to stop myself. But thank you for the privilege. And
Are you related to Mark Richardson?
no, but I know him. Yeah,
Okay.
from that used to be with Templeton and went into Episcopal Seminary of New York. I
Yeah,
think.
there's a scientific theology scientific group that he's a part of, and he edited
Yeah.
a very large book on
Yeah.
science and religion.
Yeah, we were part of the first wave of Templeton people. And
Okay,
I always really enjoyed him, but we're not related. No,
The Richardson wave.
it's been a long time.
Good. Well, we may have to have you back sometime to look more specifically at some of your texts. But
Oh,
you've
boy.
given us such a rich background and woven
Yes,
with
thank
Hart
you.
and Torrance and the world.
Yeah,
of
I think I've
theology.
been
So much.
pretty faithful to Torrance, you know, and it was fun exercise.
Hmm.
It was a blessing, because when you meet people like this, they shape your life forever. And then the other people that were shaped by someone like him, I just treasure it.
yeah.
So wishing all of you all the best, and feel free to be in touch. And if
Do
I
you want
can
to
be
just
helpful to
state
anyone, in
your
need.
email address so that if people, this will be recorded and posted on the Torrance website. So if you just can speak out
Oh.
what your email is, then people can,
Or how about if I write it in the chat?
the check goes away.
Oh, yeah, okay. And yeah, so we never got to the theological work I'm doing now. But
We can have you again in the future. You are,
whenever.
yes.
And so KAR, so Kurt Anders Richardson, KAR at abrahamsbridge, one word.com.
Okay.
And we have a website, and you might like it and check it out. So
Very good.
Great to be with
Okay,
you. Thank you
well,
for your prayer,
blessings.
Wayne. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
and
thank you very much.
blessings to all of you guys.
Thank you so much
Okay,
for taking the
and-
time, Kurt.
Okay. God
Blessings.
bless you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Kurt. I'll be in